Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. We're talking about crime in BC tonight, but what role does the media play in how we perceive crime? Here to explain is a freelance journalist based in the Vancouver area. Last month, they released their video essay, Is Vancouver Dying? A definitely non-exhaustive review, which you can now find on YouTube. They are Dustin Godfrey, and this conversation is supported by Shelter Point Single Malt Whiskey. Distinctly Vancouver Island, uniquely Shelter Point. Hi, Dustin.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. Thanks for being on the show tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much.
So you've done a lot of research into this. Is Vancouver dying because of out of control crime rates?
The thing is, if you hone in on very specific data for very specific crimes for very specific time periods, you will find justification for the narrative that you're looking for. Not you specifically.
But that some people have put out there.
Exactly. And so you will see people claiming that things like robbery in 2022 was up 21% in the first quarter compared to the average of 3 pre-pandemic years.
Okay.
But if you zoom out a little bit and look at the entire year, that difference flattens to about half of what it was at 10.7%. And then if you zoom out even further and look at the years that they didn't include, so say 2021,
right,
that difference was even further. So you're really not seeing this steady rise in crime recently, or in robberies at least. What you're seeing is little fluctuations over years. And in fact, if you zoom out even further, robberies in 2021 were, according to police statistics, the lowest in the entirety of the last 21 years.
Right. So it sounds like there's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Exactly. And so, it's not to say that there aren't areas where there have been rises in crimes. If you look at things like property crime, starting in the early to mid 2010s and until about 2019, there were, notable increases in things like theft of personal property or theft from auto. And that kind of reached a sort of fever pitch, I guess, in about 2019, and then just kind of dropped off a cliff during the pandemic.
Interesting.
But even at its kind of height in around 2019 or around that area, it still wasn't really at the point that it was in the early to mid 2000s, which were kind of, compared to today, a bit of a heyday for crime.
Okay. And I guess we should also be clear that we're not diminishing, victims of crime, but it is important to be truthful and somewhat realistic about how serious crime is in terms of its increase or decrease, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, horrific crimes are exactly that. They are horrific. But I don't think you really do much of a service to solving the issues of crime when you're not talking about it in a way that is either honest or maybe just not reflective of what we're actually seeing in the data. So if you look at things like bail reform. People, when people talk about bail reform, often they're talking about it. They don't pair it with a sort of horrific, anecdote of somebody losing their bicycle. And,
right.
That was the kind of thing that we were seeing a rise of, and people are, sort of like really feeling or experiencing, more of prior to the pandemic. What they often pair it with is a really sort of shocking story about a horrific crime. And it kind of winds up being used to justify, without really being backed up in statistics, a narrative that kind of winds up being sort of a backlash to movements from that sort of got their start, or at least really sort of started to gain momentum in the mid 2010s with things like harm reduction, and into 2020 with things like justice reform and things like defunding the police. And the kind of funny thing about that is that it winds up being sort of a backlash to things that, the policies that are being talked about from those circles are not really being meaningfully implemented. And yet they're kind of being used as scapegoats to push back on towards things like bail reform.
Right. And talking about bail reform, like there is consensus amongst Canadian premiers, asking the federal government for bail reform. And so certainly that consensus and that advocacy from premiers is coming from some sort of anxiety about crime, right? And you hear the things about repeat offenders and that this is a big problem. So ultimately, is there any truth to repeat offenders and, them being a source of increased crime?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't really speak too much to the issue of like repeat offenders per se. Like, I mean, they do exist, obviously. But I think kind of what winds up happening here is that people have these real frustrations with things like property crime, and those have been seeing real increases, at least according to police reported statistics. And that kind of winds up getting conflated with sort of violent crime as being this sort of like monolith. And
Right.
and so people's like real experiences and real frustrations are being used to sort of justify that this monolith of crime is skyrocketing, or crime is out of control, or Vancouver is dying.
Right. Yeah. Dustin, you're a journalist. I'm a talk show host. We're part of the media. Mario Canseco was just on the program, and he said that it's partially the media's fault in terms of either framing or perhaps the frequency in which crime is reported or how it's reported. So I want to ask you, is news media to blame? Are we the baddies?
I do think that there is some truth to that for sure, because you look at the way that, media reports on, say, news releases from police services or police forces, and it's often really sort of uncritical when they issue a new news release for something like a new crime. And, when people talk about things like media bias, often they're talking about it in terms of left or right or liberal or conservative or things like that, right? They're talking about a partisan or political bias.
Right.
But I think the thing that there's a little bit more evidence for is a sort of institutional bias, where there's a little bit more trust put into institutions like policing. And it gets to a point where, if you're covering council, you will, on a particular issue, you will hear from the mayor. You'll hear from a certain councillor who's maybe aligned with the mayor. You'll hear from a Green councillor. You'll hear from a one city councillor,
Right.
an ABC councillor. And when it comes to covering police news releases, that just regularly is not the case. They are published uncritically, and with the police being the only source in many, many cases, right?
But we trust them with guns. Why can't we trust them with stats?
And that's the thing. These are, institutions that we're supposed to be holding to account.
Right. No, that's fair.
And so, yeah, I don't know. There is an issue where if you see news releases coming from the police, and maybe there's more news releases from police about crimes this month than another month, people might get the impression that crime is on the rise, even if that isn't reflected in the statistics.
Right. That's fair. In covering crime, do you think that there is a bias towards sort of the sensational crime like stranger attacks versus things like domestic violence, which actually might be more widespread, but just less covered because of the nature of that crime?
Yeah, and it's not even just like more sensational crimes necessarily. You look at why, say, shoplifting is covered all the time, or talked about all the time, I should say, and maybe not wage theft, things
Right.
like that. But yeah, to get to your sort of point, I think there also actually is a very good reason that we don't talk as much about domestic violence, because when you report, when people report domestic violence to police, there is already sort of an increased risk of them being re-victimized or being, victim again to things like retribution from their abusive partner or parent or whatever it is, right?
Right.
And so I think just by sort of like raising that even further in the media, that further, sort of increases, I think, risk for those individuals. So
Sure.
there is reason to be sort of cautious in the way that you talk about things like domestic violence. But on the other hand, we do see that in, I think, 2019, domestic violence was about 11% of all calls or calls of violence to police in Canada in 2019.
Okay.
And we know that also domestic violence is among the least likely types of calls to actually be made. People who experience domestic violence are far less likely to actually call that into police than,
Right.
even like other types of violence.
Yeah.
And so, that is very much an understated statistic. And so there is very much a case to be talking more about this particular type of violence.
Yeah, fascinating. Dustin, I appreciate your work. Great job on the video essay, and thanks so much for your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
Folks, make sure you check out their video, Is Vancouver Dying? A definitely non-exhaustive review, now available on YouTube. They are Dustin Godfrey. And big thank you to Shelter Point Single Malt Whiskey for supporting local conversations and local content. Now up next, after some criticism from Canada's premiers and opposition parties, the federal government introduced a bill to make it more difficult for repeat violent offenders to be granted bail. But will this bill reduce crime? We'll talk about it. Kyla's Court with Kyla Lee is up next.